All right, what is up, guys? This is Joseph back with the Utah Utes Football Digest, and we're going to be doing a super fun exercise today. We're going to be looking at all of the teams in the Big 12, and we're going to look at all of the teams in the Pac 12, putting them together to what I'm calling the Big Pac, a super conference of sorts between the Pac 12 and the Big 12. And we're going to rank all the teams based on a variety of numbers. I'm going to break the scoring down in a second, but it should be a ton of fun, and I'm excited to dive into it with you guys. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the scoring. Okay, guys, now I'm going to go ahead and break down how we're going to do the scoring for these rankings. Just to be clear, there's no perfect way to do the scoring, but I do think these numbers should paint a pretty good picture and give us a pretty strong idea of of where these teams will rank. So I think you guys will like it a lot. Let me break it down for you. So I went off averages. So if you're below the average, you're going to score a little worse. If you're above the average, you're going to score a little better. If you're way below the average, you're going to score quite a bit worse. And if you're way above the average and you're like elite, then you're going to get a really good grade there. And I did it all in a 1 to 5 scoring system. A 5 is a really good grade, a 1 is a really bad grade. Should be pretty simple to follow. Just as an example, just going to throw one out here for you guys, like strength of schedule. So the average was 38 among all these teams. So a team like Oregon State has the 38th best schedule or 38th hardest schedule. They would get 3 points in that category because it's right dead in the middle of everybody. So I hope that makes sense. I did the same. The other numbers we're going to look at is going to be total yards per game for your offense, total points per game scored for your offense throughout the season, opponent points per game scored on your defense, opponent yards per game scored on your defense. And the really fun one that I think you guys will like a lot in this scoring system is roster ranking. So I went ahead and pulled up through Athlon Sports there. It's a roster ranking system. So who has the most talented rosters heading into 2023? And using that, I think that'll just let us account for any roster improvements or roster differences heading into 2023. And again, that went on a scale of 1 to 5. So if you had an average roster compared to the rest of the group, you get a 3, great roster 5, terrible roster 1. Pretty self-explanatory. But this should be a lot of fun, guys. Let's go ahead and dive in and let's talk about the first team on the list. Okay, so coming in last place at number 8 on the list for the Big Pack is going to be Colorado. Colorado got a score of 8. That is the worst score out of any team on this list. Now, I know a lot of Colorado fans watching this right now might not love the fact that they got such a poor score, but I would say it was tough. I thought about looking up coaching to help Colorado out, but the truth is, it wasn't going to help out that much. And Colorado has a good roster, but compared to the rest of the teams on this list, it's not that good comparatively. It's it scored a 2 on the roster ranking according to Athlon Sports, or according to this scorecard that I pulled from the information given to me from Athlon Sports. So let's go ahead and break Colorado down. Their strength of schedule score was a 2. It was 50th strength of schedule, so not super tough. Um, then their total yards per game, obviously they were dreadful last year. It was 282 yards per game, 127th in the country. They get a 1 there. Points per game, 125th in the country, 15 points per game, terrible. And, the defense is even worse with 131st ranking and 130th ranking for opponent yards per game and opponent scoring. So, pretty bad. There's not a lot of bright spots. I'd say if there's one team that I felt like maybe got gypped a little, it's Colorado. Do I think Colorado is the worst team in the league next year out of all these teams? No, I don't think that. But the scoring is a little eye opening to tell you, like, to take a step back and say, okay, maybe we are getting a little too high on Colorado. They scored worse than any other team, and this took the rosters into account. And they have a below average roster compared to everyone else on the list. So everyone talking about um, the roster should chill out a little bit. So that's Colorado, and let's move on to the next team on this list. All right, and now let's talk about the team that came in at number 21 on the list, so second to last. It is Cal. Cal got a score of 9. It is actually tied for second to last with the team I'll mention right after this, but two-way tie for second to last. Cal is one of those teams. Strength of schedule last year was 66th in the country, and that doesn't help them. And they didn't really do super well. I mean, 87th in total yards per game. That's 360 yards per game. 23 points per game. That's 91. Defense a little better than the offense, but not by much. I mean, not great all around there. Roster score was a little below average. So, you know, you'd want a lot more from Cal. They're really good academically, but did not score well on this rankings. Okay, and here we go with the other team that tied for the 21st spot on the list. So tied for last place. It is Arizona State. Another situation pretty rough across the board. Below average roster with a score of 2. They're the 51st roster in the country. Points per game score. Not points per game, opponent points per game, opponent yards per game, pretty bad. So rough defense. That was a 1 and a 2. So just not great there all around for Arizona State. Pretty rough across the board. So not a good look for Arizona State. Hopefully with Kenny Dillingham, that'll move the needle a little bit. But don't forget, we broke down these rosters. Even this is including these coaches coming in and doing the transfer portal and bringing their talent. So I'm trying to keep this as real as I can as we break down these rankings. But so that was the first three, the three worst teams on the list, and we'll move on to the next one now. All right, and so the Pac-12 definitely took the bottom three, and the clearly three worst teams on this list were Colorado, Cal, and Arizona State. But now as we move into slightly better teams, it'll start to ramp up pretty quickly, and we should have some. I felt like looking at those teams is basically just a rough go. There wasn't a lot of bright spots, but these next teams should have some, positives that we can actually talk about. So the next one coming in at number 19 on the list is West Virginia. Now, West Virginia, where they shine and have a bump above the Pac 12 teams they're ahead of, is going to be in roster. They scored a 3 for roster. They have the 38th best roster in the country, so pretty solid roster there. And last year's strength of schedule was 20th in the country, which gave them a score of 3. So pretty tough strength of schedule there. Not very good offensively or defensively, though. Their numbers were not good last year. You'd want a lot more from them there. They're not the worst team in the world. I know there's a lot of hardcore West Virginia fans out there, and I know the expectations were high last year, but the roster is still good, and hopefully they can bounce back in 23. All right, and now moving on to number 18, we have another Pac-12 team, and this is a really weird one. It is going to be Stanford, the Stanford Cardinal. Now, Stanford, their big highlight is that they have the number 24 roster in the country, which gives them a roster score of 5. They're one of the best rosters on this entire list. Very good roster at Stanford. Just looking for a coach to come in with the right opportunity and make it happen. Then they have that new coaching coming in, so you never know, it could turn it around. They also had a pretty tough strength of schedule last year, a 47th strength of schedule in the country. But on the field, they performed pretty dreadfully, scoring a 1 in every offensive and every defensive category. So hopefully they can bounce back next year and make their way up the rankings. Let's move on to the next team. I did forget to mention when I was breaking down Stanford that this 18th place where Stanford was is actually a four-way tie for 15th place. So it is actually a four-way tie for 15th place between Stanford and a few other teams. The next team in that tie is going to be Arizona, the Arizona Wildcats. And where they did really well is offense. Not a very good job on defense, but their offense was very high powered. They had a 4 offensive score for 467 yards per game, 15th in the country, and a 3 offensive points per game score at 31 points per game, 39th in the country. They really lit it up last year, and if you guys know, if you had to play Arizona last year, you know that they lit it up. They looked awesome, and definitely a force to be reckoned with this year. The issue is the defense for Arizona was really bad, and they definitely needed to do more there. Hopefully, they've made some adjustments, and we can see a little better. Also, not the greatest roster in the world, which brings them down a little bit there. And the next team in this tie for 15th place is going to be Washington State, Wazoo. Now, Washington State has some pretty cool numbers here, also some pretty rough numbers in some spots. Where they really shined seems to be their defense was probably their best spot. I mean, you look here, they had a 4 score for defensive points per game allowed, only 23 points per game allowed, which was 37th in the country. And then yards per game allowed, they were a little worse. They were 92nd, 415 yards per game allowed. So not great there, but they don't have too many huge weak spots for Washington State. Roster could be a little better, though. They scored a 1 for roster, definitely one of the worst rosters in this list. So hopefully they can improve that as we head into this next year. All right. And the final team in the tie for 15th place is going to be BYU. Now, BYU, again, another one of these teams with some real ups and downs. They got a 1 for strength of schedule, played a relatively easy schedule compared to the rest of the group here. Yards per game score was decent at a 2, slightly below average, but not bad. Points per game, they had 30 points per game, 47th in the country. They got a 3 there. Um, then we got opponent points per game was they were letting up 30 points per game. So you can see why they had the record they did. They had 30 points per game and 30 points per game allowed. So right dead in the middle there. Roster score was a 1, though. Not a very good roster over there at BYU heading into this next year. All right, and we have another little tie grouping here. It is a 3-way tie for 12th place. We're going to start with Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State scored a total score of 13, 3 score on the roster, so solid there. Basically, you got a lot of 2s here, tough strength of schedule, the 3. Uh, Not a ton of weak spots. Defense definitely looks like the area they need to improve. But relative to the conference, I mean, one of the reasons some of these teams are scoring, like the numbers sound so bad defensively, but it's not really hurting them on the list, is the fact that both these conferences weren't very good defensively. So should be good. So Oklahoma State tied 3-way tie for 12th place. Okay, and here we go with another team for the 3-way tie for 12th place. We have Cincinnati. Cincinnati scored a 13 total score. Very bad in the roster category, 59th roster in the country. And, for Power 5, it's very bad. That's a 1 score for the roster. But they did have some really good categories, and the best one being opponent points per game allowed. They only allowed 22 points per game, which puts them at 19th in the country for points per game. So very good numbers there. Cincinnati, it was a struggle last year on offense, replacing a lot of talent. It just looked like they were just a little out of sorts all year. So hopefully this next year they can bounce back, but the roster's a little deprived of talent right now. All right, now the final team in the 3-way tie for 12th place is going to be Houston. Houston is, similar to Cincinnati in the roster talent, very low there. Another bad strength of schedule. Where they really bump up their ranking is points per game scored and yards per game and offensive yards per game. So both those got a score of 4, but the issue is their defensive scores were pretty rough on the list. So really high powered offense last year at Houston, but they had some other areas where they were a little less than desirable. But that's Houston. So it's the final team in the 3-way tie for 12th place. All right, now we have another tie. It's a 2-way tie for 10th place here. So the first team is going to be the University of Kansas. Now, where the University of Kansas struggles roster and defense, really bad defense, bad roster, but they did play a very tough schedule last year, and their offense was high flying, 433 yards per game, 33rd in the country there, and 34 points per game, which is 22nd in the country there. So they had a high powered offense, and I remember early in the season they looked awesome. So good team there in Kansas. Not a ton of talent on the roster, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them creep up this list next year. And the other team that is tied for 10th place is UCF. UCF, very strong team. Overall roster, another team where the roster is not very good. Strength of schedule was bad, but a high-powered offense. It's really similar to Kansas with UCF. The score of 4 for the offense, total yards per game, 459, 18th in the country. 31 points per game for the offense is 37th in the country, so a 3 score there. Uh, you know, defense not as good, but not quite as bad as Kansas on defense. The difference is that UCF played a significantly easier schedule than Kansas did, so that had to be taken into account. So that's UCF. Okay, and we are now in the top 10 of the list. If you guys are enjoying the list so far and appreciate the video, please make sure you drop the video a like. Also, comment down below, what do you guys think of the list so far? Do you think any of the rankings are too strong or a little off? Feel free to drop that in the chat. But also make sure you guys subscribe to the channel. If you guys like this type of content, uh, I'd love to have you come back to the channel. So make sure you subscribe and let's move on the list. Okay, so we do have a team that did not tie here with Texas Tech. Really solid team, high powered offense, tough schedule. A 4 score on the schedule with the 12th hardest schedule in the country. 26th in the country for yards per game, which is a 3 score. And then you got 32nd in the country for points per game, 32 points per game. It's another 3 score. The big issue with them was the defensive production. Their defense struggled in points per game and yards per game, and a small knock on them because of the roster. They scored a 2 there, not a super talented roster. So that's Texas Tech, and they came in at number 9. Okay, now we do have another tie for 7th place. The first team we're going to look at is Baylor with a total score of 16. Very good, solid roster, a 3 score on the roster score. That's the 36th roster in the country. Really solid team. Played the 19th toughest schedule in the country, so we gave them a 4 there. But there was a lot to be desired. They had that young quarterback in there that really had some ups and downs. The guy's name is slipping from my mind, but I remember watching him because of BYU because, this is the Utah Utes Football Digest. And just a little disappointing there. Overall, a team I would not be shocked at all to see be higher on these rankings in the next offseason. So looks like a solid team, and I expected a lot more from them last year than they did. Hopefully, this next year will prove to be a better year for them. Okay, and the other team that tied for 7th place is Oregon State. Oregon State is a team I have a lot of respect for. One of the best defenses in the country here. 50th or 11th in opponent points per game allowed with 19 points per game, and opponent yards per game allowed was 339, which puts them at 24th in the country there. They scored a 5 in the opponent points per game and a 4 in the opponent yards per game. Really good team here. Where I had to give them a knock is one of the worst rosters on this list, right? Oregon State gets a 1 for the roster score, and strength of schedule wasn't super tough. It was a 2. It wasn't good. It wasn't easy. But very good team. Oregon State is one of my favorite teams in college football outside of Utah. It was pretty fun for Utah to kind of smash them last year. So pretty cool there. All right, and now we are creeping up into the elite teams with number 6. Actually, this is a two-way tie for number 5, and the first team in the two-way tie for number 5 is going to be Iowa State. Now, Iowa State played a very tough schedule, a top 18 schedule. So you had to give them a 4 there for the strength of schedule score. Offense was pretty dreadful for Iowa State, but where they shined was defense. 21 points per game, 18th in the country allowed on defense, and 283 yards per game allowed on defense, which is second in the country. That's crazy good. Uh, they got fives in both of those categories, and they have a 3 score on the roster score. Pretty solid team overall. Really good defense. If they could get an offense to, they lost Brock Purdy, they lost Brees Hall. If they can get some weapons in there that can replenish that offense sometime soon, it'll be a really deadly team. Okay, and the next team in the two-way tie for number 5 is going to be Kansas State. Kansas State, very solid squad, very well-rounded here. Now, kind of a weird one with them. They played a really tough strength of schedule, 7th toughest in the country. They got a 5 there. The one thing that drops them down a lot is their roster score. They do not have a very good roster on the team right now. So you got to bump them for that, just taking that into account. Pretty good defense. Opponent yards per game, only 383. Opponent points per game, very impressive, though, 24 points per game. That's 38th in the country. Also, offense was pretty solid. Yards per game, 421. Offensive points per game, 32. So, very good team. It's not surprising that they had some of those big splash wins towards the end of the year last year. Impressive team. Definitely one to keep an eye on in 23. Okay, this next little grouping is interesting. We're into the final four, and there is two ties at the top here. We're gonna have a tie for third and fourth place, and a tie for first and second place. So very interesting here. Tie for fourth place. The first team in that tie is going to be TCU. High powered team, one of the best points per game teams in the country, 37 points per game. That's ninth in the country. Solid roster heading in the next year. 31st best roster in the country. That's a 4 score for the roster. Really, really solid team there for TCU. Offense was great. Yards per game, 443. So, really good team. I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like this was a big year for TCU. Probably some regression next year, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're able to keep the ball rolling with a really good roster into next year and really, continue that legacy of success they've proven to have. And the other team that tied for fourth place is Washington Huskies. So they have a roster score of 3. They have an opponent points per game score of 3. Very good team. And the highlight of their team is the offense. Second in total yards per game and 8th in total points per game. They had a nuts season last year. Michael Penix looks like a boss. It looks like he's going to be a beast. They actually got a slight bump down in this one because of their strength of schedule. It was not a tough strength of schedule. It was the 44th strength of schedule in the country. And I know you can't control what your strength of schedule is. That's fair. But why are teams averaging 28 points per game against you and 393 yards per game against you? Now, that's not a good sign if you want to be, in that top team conversation. But Washington's a team I have my eye on for next year. Very good crew over there in Seattle. So those are the two teams that tied for fourth place. Okay, and the two first place teams, I'm just going to say them now. So you guys, if you're following, you probably know who they are already, but I'll just go ahead and say them now. It is Oregon and Utah. And yes, this is a Utah YouTube channel. No, I literally just did these numbers as how I look at football, and Utah came out on top. To be fair, Utah is a really well rounded team, which helps you a lot on a list like this. But that's what football is. It's about being well-rounded and having playmakers. So, anyways, let's talk about Oregon first. Oregon roster score of 5. It is a great roster over there at Oregon, number 9 in the entire country. So, really tough team to beat. They also had a yards per game score of 5 because they averaged 492 yards per game, which was 8th in the country. Points per game, they were 36 points per game, which is 12th in the country. Really, really good team. So they were high flying beginning to end. So really good squad there with Oregon. Defense is kind of where they struggled. It was their passing defense that really made them look bad. They got a 3 score on both defensive categories, but if they can improve some of the question marks on defense, they could be such a good team. And honestly, with Oregon, just to touch on it for a minute, because I've watched Utah. They took us out last year, but I got to see the season before that where Utah really uh, made it so they didn't go to the college football playoff and kind of turned that from an amazing season to Oregon to kind of not an embarrassing season, but 2 embarrassing games against Utah for Oregon. I'm sure that's how the fans feel, but Oregon, great team. Everyone I've met that covers Oregon, I like them. I like talking to them. So that's Oregon. All right, and finally, Utah comes in with the tie with Oregon at number 1. Utah has a roster score of 4, 26th best roster in the country. Opponent points per game score of 3, and opponent yards per game score of 3, and opponent points per game score of 4. Yards per game score 4, points per game score 4, strength of schedules of 4. Utah, they don't have 1-5. They're one of the only teams this is the top of this list without a 5 in one category, but Utah is all about being well-rounded, good, solid, sound, disciplined football. And I think that's what gave them the edge over a lot of the teams here. They didn't have a lot of weaknesses, and this list does knock you a lot if you have weaknesses. So that's the list, guys. I hope you've enjoyed the breakdown, and I'm sure I have some unconscious biases towards Utah, but I really tried not to put them into this, not to put the bias into this list and keep it fair. Really, no matter what I did, Utah just kind of kept coming out on top. All right, outside of that, guys, make sure you like the video. It'll help get it out to more fans. Also, comment down below. What do you guys think? What do you think of the rankings? Who's ranked too high? Who's ranked too low? And make sure you guys subscribe to the channel, whether you're a Utah fan, whether you're a Big 12 fan or a Pac 12 fan. This should be a fun channel for you. So make sure you hop on for the ride. I'm out, guys. I'll see you later.